Hollywood sold you a lie about the women of the Old West. The real woman of 1880 woke up before sunrise, fed 8 mouths, did the laundry, sewed, and often buried her own children. She did all of that without the right to vote, without a bank account, and without a doctor nearby. She didn't wait for anyone to save her. She conquered that land with her own hands. This is the real story. Fact 1. Marriage in the 1880s was a contract in which a woman lost her legal identity. In the United States in the 1880s, when a man and a woman got married, something happened that would seem absurd today. The woman ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of the law. That is not an exaggeration. It was literally what happened under the American legal system. This came from a rule inherited from English law called coverture. It worked like this. The moment a woman got married, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could no longer sign contracts on her own. In most states, she could not own property in her own name. If she worked and earned a salary, that money legally belonged to her husband. And there was more. A married woman could not refuse sexual relations with her husband without facing legal consequences. The law simply did not recognize that right for her. Think about that for a second. We are talking about a system where getting married meant handing control over your body, your money, and your decisions to someone else. And all of it was backed by American law. The country only began to significantly dismantle these rules almost a century later. Fact 2. Childbirth killed 1 out of every 100 pregnant women. Having a child in 1880 was like betting your life on a coin toss. Out of every 100 births, at least 1 mother did not survive. Today, that number has dropped to 23 deaths per 100,000 births, but back then, it was between 600 and 800. And here is the detail that changes everything. The average family had between 5 and 8 children. That means a woman who made it to age 35 had already risked dying half a dozen times or more. There was no hospital waiting for her. The birth took place at home in the bedroom with a local midwife who had learned the job through hands-on experience without any kind of medical training. If the baby was in the wrong position, there was not much anyone could do. If heavy bleeding started after the birth, the chances of controlling it were slim. And puerperal fever, an infection that spread quickly, claimed mothers' lives within days. The hardest part of all this is that every woman knew about the risk before she even became pregnant. It was not a surprise, it was part of life. Every pregnancy was faced with the very real awareness that it could be the last thing she ever did. Fact 3. The Comstock Act of 1873 made any information about birth control illegal. In 1893, the U.S. Congress passed a law that changed the lives of millions of women for nearly a century. The Comstock Act classified any information about contraceptive methods as obscene material. Medical books, letters from doctors, health pamphlets, all of it became illegal to send through the federal mail system. The man behind the law was Anthony Comstock, a postal inspector with the authority to intercept mail. He took that mission seriously. Over the course of his career, he personally destroyed tons of material he considered immoral. In practice, a doctor who wrote to a patient explaining how to prevent pregnancy was committing a federal crime. Think about that. A woman who had already been through 5 or 6 difficult births with a real risk of death could not legally receive a letter from her own doctor with basic guidance. The knowledge existed, but the law kept it from reaching the people who needed it most. And this was not something that lasted only a short time. Federal and state versions of this legislation remained in effect until the 1960s and 1970s. For nearly 100 years, the system treated medical information about contraception as if it were pornography. Fact 4. Domestic violence. was legally tolerated in most states. In the 1880s, if a man beat his wife inside their home, the police simply did not show up. It was not negligence, it was policy. It was treated as a domestic matter, something between a husband and wife, and the government stayed out of it. The courts followed the same logic. Convictions were rare, and when they did happen, the penalties were so light that they made no difference at all. But the detail few people know is something else. If the woman decided to run away from home to escape the violence, her husband could legally force her to return. He had legal custody over her, almost under the same terms as he would over property. The law was on his side. There is an old expression, rule of thumb, which many historians cite as a reference to a supposed law that allowed a husband to beat his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. The exact origin of that expression is still debated today. But what is not debated is that violence was tolerated in practice, with legal backing. And this brings us to a point that changes how many people understand the temperance movement. Those women who marched against alcohol were not just concerned about drinking. Their main target was the violence that drunken husbands caused inside the home. Fact 5. Female teachers were automatically fired when they got married. For decades in the United States, there was a rule that many people today cannot even imagine. If a female teacher got married, she lost her job the next day. It did not matter whether she was competent, dedicated, or whether her students liked her. Once she got married, she was out. It was that simple. They called it marry and resign, which basically meant getting married and quitting your job. This policy began back in the 1880s and was in place in most school districts across the country. The reasoning behind it was that a married woman was supposed to take care of the house and her husband, and that working outside the home was incompatible with those responsibilities. There was another detail that few people mention. Many districts considered it inappropriate for a married woman to be in the classroom. The practical result was cruel. A woman who needed her salary to survive simply could not get married. And a woman who decided to get married lost her only source of income. It was a trap with no way out. She was forced to choose between having a family and having financial independence. And the most shocking part is that this rule did not last for just a short time. In many parts of the United States, this policy was not abandoned until the 1940s and 1950s. Fact 6. Housework lasted 14 to 16 hours a day without modern tools. Think about your morning routine. You wake up, turn on the coffee maker, and open the faucet. Now imagine waking up at 4 in the morning in the dark and having to start a fire before doing anything else. That was how a woman's day began on an American farm in the 1880s. Research from the time documented 14 to 16-hour stretches of non-stop housework. Washing clothes for a family of 6 alone took around 8 hours. Everything was done by hand, with no machine and no running water. The water came from the well, 1 bucket at a time. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were made from scratch, with no refrigerator and nothing ready-made. Between meals, this woman also sewed clothes, cared for the children, and looked after the sick members of the household. If you put that same amount of work into a spreadsheet and paid her by the hour, it would be equal to the work of a highly productive female farm laborer. But no one paid her anything. The law did not recognize it as work. In official documents, she was simply a housewife. The title did not match the reality of someone who worked longer hours than most men in the fields. Fact 7. Women's clothing in the 1880s was almost like a physical prison. Imagine wearing 20 kilograms of clothing just to go to a dinner. In the 1880s, that was exactly what women did. A complete formal outfit weighed between 15 and 20 kilograms, more than many soldiers carried in field gear during military campaigns. Just for context, an infantry soldier at the time carried around 13 kilograms on his back. The woman standing next to him at the ball carried more weight, except hers came in the form of fabric, frames, and accessories. The corset was the centerpiece of this routine. It was not optional. A woman considered respectable simply did not leave the house without one. In extreme cases, the waist was compressed to less than 50 centimeters. This pushed internal organs out of place, made breathing difficult, and made almost any physical effort practically impossible. Doctors at the time were already documenting serious damage to the liver, ribs, and reproductive organs of women who had worn corsets for decades. Under the skirts, structures made of metal and fabric called crinolines and bustles added even more weight and volume. A woman was literally trapped inside her own clothing. It was not a matter of vanity. It was a social requirement, as strict as any military dress code, except with real and lasting physical consequences. Fact 8. Hysteria was a real diagnosis, and doctors treated it with pelvic stimulation. During the Victorian era, doctors had a catch-all diagnosis for any woman who stepped out of line: hysteria. The word comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. You can already see where this is going. Any behavior a male doctor considered outside the norm became an illness. A sad woman, hysteria. An irritated woman, hysteria. A woman who wanted to study or refused a marriage proposal, hysteria too. The diagnosis worked as a tool of control disguised as medicine, and the treatment was even more disturbing. Medical manuals from the 1880s described a procedure called pelvic massage, performed by the doctor himself or by a midwife. The stated goal was to trigger what they called a hysterical paroxysm to relieve the symptoms. The electric vibrator was created during this same period, specifically to make the procedure faster and more practical in doctors' offices. It was not seen as something sexual. It was considered routine medical treatment. This diagnosis survived for decades without being seriously questioned. Hysteria was not removed from the American Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual until 1952. Fact 9. The age of consent for marriage was 10 to 12 in most states. This is going to shock you. In 1880, Delaware law allowed sexual relations with girls as young as 10 years old. In most other states, the limit was 12. There was no real protection for children at the time. If the parents agreed, a 12-year-old girl could legally marry a man who was 30 or 40 years old. And this happened frequently, as documented in official county records across the country. The legal system simply made no distinction between a child and an adult when it came to marriage. The only requirement was the parents' signature. Think about that for a second. In England, journalist W.T. Stead decided to prove the scale of the problem in a radical way. He staged the purchase of a 13-year-old girl and published the entire story in a newspaper in 1885. The story exploded. In the United States, activists like Josephine Butler pressured lawmakers state by state for decades. It was a slow process. From the 1890s through 1920, states gradually raised the age of consent to 16 or 18. It took nearly 40 years of fighting for the law to recognize something that seems basic today. Children should not marry adults. Fact 10. Black women in the South lived under conditions of near slavery. Many people think slavery ended for good in 1865. But what happened in the South after that was something history books preferred not to tell properly. When federal troops withdrew in 1877, Southern states created a system that in practice put black people back into captivity. They called them vagrancy laws. It worked like this. Any black person who could not prove they had a job could be arrested. And once arrested, they were leased to farmers and companies through a system known as convict leasing. They worked for free under armed guard in brutal conditions. For black women, the situation was even worse. There was no legal protection against abuse. Their marriages were not recognized. They were denied access to schools. And the federal government, which had sent soldiers to guarantee their freedom just a few years earlier, simply turned its back on them. It was not called slavery, but in practice, that was exactly what it was. The system lasted for decades, generating profits for the same landowners who had previously owned slaves. The only difference was the paperwork. Fact 11. The U.S. government tore Indigenous children away from their mothers to civilize them. Imagine someone knocking on your door and taking your children away, without your permission, with no date for their return. That is exactly what the federal government did to Indigenous families between 1880 and 1890. Children as young as 5 were removed from their communities and sent to government-run boarding schools. The idea behind the program had an official motto that said it all: kill the Indian, save the man. Inside these schools, children were forbidden from speaking their own languages. Any reference to their native culture was punished. Indigenous girls, in particular, were often sent to work for free in the homes of local white families as domestic servants. Sanitary conditions were so poor that diseases like tuberculosis and measles killed between 20 and 50% of the students at some of these institutions. And parents often did not find out that their children had died until weeks or months later. The death rate at these boarding schools was higher than that of any other group in the American population during the same period. It was not negligence. It was documented public policy. Fact 12. Divorce was practically impossible for women without financial resources. In the 1880s, divorce was already legal in every American state. But existing under the law and being accessible in practice were two completely different things. The process was expensive. It required a lawyer, time, and solid evidence. A woman who wanted to leave a marriage had to present legal grounds recognized by the court. In most states, that meant proving adultery, abandonment, or physical cruelty with documentation. Psychological abuse, alcoholism, and financial neglect were not considered valid grounds. So a husband could drink away his entire paycheck, humiliate his wife every day, and the court would still say there were no grounds to end the marriage. And even when a woman managed to get a divorce, custody of the children usually went to the father. Children were treated as part of the man's property. The woman left the marriage without her children, without property, and without income. With no right to her own bank account and almost no access to jobs that paid enough to survive, a divorced woman without a family willing to take her faced poverty. Society also branded her as a failure at the only role she had been assigned. Fact 13. Women doctors existed and were systematically excluded. In 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States. But what few people know is how she got that spot. Geneva Medical College in New York put the decision to a vote among its male students, who approved her admission as a kind of joke. No one thought she would take it seriously. She did. She graduated at the top of her class. And even then, no hospital in New York would hire her after graduation. By 1880, there were already hundreds of women doctors in the country. But the American Medical Association continued to formally block them from joining. Hospitals refused to give these professionals the right to treat patients. The women doctors' response was direct. They founded their own hospitals. And here is the detail that bothered those who defended their exclusion. These hospitals run by women often had more organized environments and higher recovery rates than comparable hospitals run by men. The barriers were never about technical ability. They were about protecting a professional market reserved exclusively for men. Fact 14. In 1880, a domestic servant earned between $3 and $5 a week. A worker in a textile factory made about the same. Working in a laundry paid a little more, maybe $6 in a good week. Now think about this. An established prostitute in a mining town could bring in $30 in that same week. That was 6 times more than any other job available to a woman at the time. We are not talking about moral opinions here. We are talking about hard numbers that explain real decisions made by real people. The Old West had a brutal economy, and the options for women on their own were extremely limited. If she had no family nearby, if she could not find a husband, or if she was running away from an even worse situation, the math was simple and straightforward. On one side, guaranteed poverty with respectability that did not pay the bills. On the other, enough money to survive, but with a heavy social stigma. Female teachers earned a little more, making up to $12 a week in larger cities. But the job required the woman to remain single. Once she got married, she lost the position. The economic reality of the time did not leave many doors open. Fact 15. In 1869, Myra Bradwell took the Illinois bar exam and earned a perfect score. Any man with that result would have received his license without a problem. Bradwell did not. The reason was simple. She was a woman. Bradwell refused to accept that and took the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 1873, the justices ruled against her. The official reasoning stated that natural and divine law reserved the home for women, not the courtroom. Think about that. The most powerful court in the country said that a woman with a perfect score could not practice law because God did not want her to. Illinois did not grant Bradwell her license until 1890, 21 years after she had passed the exam. Meanwhile, Belva Lockwood decided to tackle the problem from a different direction. She personally went to Congress and campaigned for a law allowing women to practice as attorneys before the Supreme Court. She succeeded in 1879. Neither of these women was barred because she lacked ability. Both proved they knew enough. The system simply had not been built to include them, and it only changed when they forced that change from the inside out. Fact 16. In the 1880s, when an unmarried woman became pregnant, her life was basically over. I am not exaggerating. She lost her job, lost her housing, because many rental agreements had clauses requiring what they called moral conduct, and lost any real chance of getting married in the future. The entire community turned its back on her. Now think about this. What about the man involved? In most states, he had no legal obligation whatsoever. None. Proving paternity was practically impossible at the time, and even when someone tried, the courts almost never did anything about it. There were so-called seduction statutes, laws that theoretically allowed a man to be sued if he had seduced a woman with false promises of marriage. But in practice, they almost never worked. The results showed up in orphanages. Most of the children there were not actually orphans. They were the children of mothers who simply had no way to raise a child alone, without a job, without a home, and without support from anyone. Two people made the same decision together, but only one paid the price. And that was not an accident. It was the system working exactly as it was designed. Fact 17. Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting in 1872. Most people know her name because of the $1 coin, but few know what she actually did to end up on that coin. In November 1872, Susan B. Anthony walked into a polling place in Rochester, New York, and voted in the presidential election. At the time, it was illegal for women to vote. She knew that before she walked in. 2 weeks later, a federal marshal knocked on her door and arrested her. The charge was illegal voting. The trial that followed was even more absurd than the arrest. The judge did not allow Susan to testify in her own defense because, under the law at the time, a woman did not have that right in a federal court. But the part that is truly shocking is something else. The judge had already written the verdict before the trial even began. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket and read the guilty verdict to the jury, telling them they did not even need to deliberate. The fine was $100. She looked at the judge and said she would not pay a single penny. And she never did. The government never enforced the payment, probably because a new trial would have brought even more attention to her cause. Susan died in 1906. The amendment that guaranteed women the right to vote did not come until 1920, 14 years later. Fact 18. Women of the Old West carried guns and knew how to use them. When we think of the Old West, we picture cowboys armed to the teeth. But there is one detail almost no one talks about. Women carried guns too, and it was not for fun. It was simply a matter of survival. In isolated territories, husbands left to work cattle or went on trips that lasted for weeks. The woman stayed alone on the property with the children. If an intruder, a wild animal, or any other threat showed up, there was no sheriff to call. There was no neighbor nearby. She was that family's only protection, so learning how to handle a rifle or a revolver was not a choice. It was a basic necessity. Annie Oakley became famous around the world precisely because she took something thousands of ordinary women already did every day to an extraordinary level. Court records from the time reveal a surprising fact. Women were put on trial for killing intruders and even violent ex-husbands. And in most cases, all male juries acquitted them. Those men understood the reality of the frontier. They knew that in that setting, defending yourself with a gun was not an overreaction. It was the bare minimum needed to stay alive. Fact 19. Annie Oakley could hit a coin tossed into the air from 30 meters away. Calamity Jane rode through territories that most men avoided. These two women became famous in the Old West and turned into symbols of the idea that any woman could achieve whatever she wanted if she had enough determination. But here is what no one liked to mention. Oakley worked within an entertainment show. She shot on a stage under Buffalo Bill's rules, while he profited from her performance. Outside that stage, the doors remained locked. Women could not vote in most states. They could not practice law. Medical schools routinely denied admission to women. The system pointed to Oakley and Jane, as if to say that the path was open to everyone. But they were precisely the exceptions that proved just how closed that path really was. For every Annie Oakley the public applauded, there were thousands of women with equal or greater ability who never had the chance to prove anything. Using these two figures as an argument that the system worked was like saying the lottery proves that everyone can become rich. The existence of a few isolated winners never meant that the rules were fair. It meant exactly the opposite. Fact 20. Between 1870 and 1890, American women led the largest wave of social activism the country had ever seen. And here is the detail that makes you stop and think. Not one of them could vote. They founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874, which became one of the largest organizations in the country. They led campaigns against alcohol, reformed orphanages and prisons, and created the first settlement houses to welcome immigrants in major cities. The suffrage movement grew during this period, along with efforts connected to the abolitionist cause that continued after the Civil War. And why was there so much action? Precisely because voting was not an option. Without access to the ballot box, these women developed other tools: direct pressure on politicians, community organizing, public campaigns, and moral mobilization. They basically wrote the modern playbook for grassroots activism. The result was that when the 19th Amendment finally guaranteed women the right to vote in 1920, women already had decades of experience organizing mass movements. They did not enter politics as beginners. They entered as veterans who had already changed laws, shut down saloons, and transformed entire institutions without ever casting a ballot. Fact 21. Today, everyone knows that women live longer than men. It seems like it has always been that way, right? Wrong. In the 1880s, women's life expectancy was equal to or even lower than men's. And the reason will surprise you with its brutal simplicity. Every pregnancy was a game of Russian roulette. With no properly equipped hospitals, no adequate hygiene, and no antibiotics, childbirth killed women on a scale we can barely imagine today. Between the ages of 15 and 45, women died at a higher rate than men of the same age. Not from a rare disease, not from war, but from something as natural as having a child. What changed this situation was a series of medical advances throughout the 20th century. First came asepsis, the simple idea that doctors should wash their hands before delivering a baby. Then came properly trained obstetricians, and in the 1930s came sulfa drugs and penicillin, which fought infections that had once been a death sentence. This transformation was probably the single greatest victory in the history of women's health in the United States. The advantage women have in longevity today is not something that has always existed. It is a recent medical achievement built over decades. Fact 22. Young widows lost custody of their children when they remarried. Imagine losing your wife, getting married again, and no one questioning it. Your children stay with you, period. Now, reverse the situation. In the 1880s, when a widow decided to remarry, her late husband's family could show up and take the children away, legally. The paternal grandparents, uncles, or any relative on the man's side had more rights over those children than the mother who gave birth to and raised every one of them. The reasoning behind this was simple and brutal. The law considered children to belong to the father's bloodline. Paternal blood carried more weight than any maternal bond. When the widow remarried, her new husband took on the role of head of the household, but the laws in several states did not recognize him as the legal guardian of his stepchildren. This created a legal vacuum that the deceased husband's family could easily exploit. In practice, the woman faced an impossible decision. She could remain alone, without income or protection, in a society that did not offer decent jobs to women. Or she could marry again and risk losing her children to people who often barely knew them. A widower at the same time would never have faced that dilemma. Fact 23. The trick that allowed women to speak in public in the U.S. In 1850s America, the idea of a woman stepping onto a stage and speaking to a mixed audience of men and women was practically unthinkable. Society simply did not accept it. But the spiritualist movement opened a loophole that no one had planned. The logic worked like this: the medium was not speaking on her own behalf. It was the spirit speaking, using her body as a channel. That changed everything. A woman speaking on her own authority was seen as a threat to the established order. But a woman delivering a message from a spirit People tolerated that. And many women recognized this opportunity. Spiritualist seances became the first spaces where a woman could address 200 people without being immediately silenced or ridiculed. Several of the country's first female public speakers got their start in exactly those settings. Some of them later became directly involved in the women's suffrage movement. The detail that stands out is the contradiction at the center of it all. To be heard as people with something to say, these women first had to convince the public that they were not the ones speaking. They pretended to be passive instruments, precisely so they could claim an active place in American public life. Fact 24. Pioneer. Women's Diaries. Tell a story Hollywood never showed. There are hundreds of diaries written by women who crossed the country, heading west between 1870 and 1890. These documents have been preserved in universities and public archives. And what is written on those pages has nothing to do with what we saw in the movies. These women recorded going entire months without seeing another adult woman. They wrote about physical labor so grueling that it aged their bodies within just a few years. Many wrote about missing the mothers and sisters they had left behind in the East, knowing they might never see them again. And then there are the entries that are hardest to read, mothers describing the deaths of their own children, sometimes more than one, from diseases that would be easily treated today. Historians consider these passages some of the most heartbreaking documents ever produced during that period. But here is what makes these diaries truly important. Those same women also wrote about pride. Pride in building a home, in learning to do things they had never imagined, in looking out over untamed land and feeling that they belonged there. They were not movie characters waiting to be rescued. They were real people dealing with a system that was not built for them and still creating something with their own hands.